Open up your Bibles to Job chapter 1. We're going to be in the text of Scripture that was just read a little while ago here this morning. Job chapter 1. We were sitting today in our pre-service prayer meeting that we have as pastoral and staff people. And Nick said, man, God knew we were starting a series on Job. I said, how? He said, He gave us the perfect weather for a Job series. And wouldn't you say that's the case? I mean, if it was bright and sunny and 75, I think I would have shifted and gone to Ephesians or something like that. But I mean, this is like that's Job right there. That weather right through that window. And so as we embark upon the series, there's a lot of tension in Job. There's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of fog. There's dark skies. There's clouds. There's things that we need to figure out. And that's what we're going to embark to do in this sermon series on the book of Job. Have any of you ever asked the question, I'm sure you have before, but have any of you ever asked the question, why God? Have you asked why? Why, Lord? Why is this happening? Why has this happened? I think there's probably times every week we ask the question, why? As we start this series, I was drawn towards a news story that came out a while back that hit very close to home. It was just over the summer. There was a young couple in their early 20s named Cheyenne and Dalton, students at a Bible college in Ankeny that a lot of us here at this church have attended at some point or another. They dated, got engaged, got married this last summer. After the wedding, Dalton's parents loaded up the wedding gifts and delivered them to the couple's future apartment, and the happy couple sped off to their honeymoon. Florida was the destination. A nice, relaxing beach vacation together as a new couple. This was a new experience for the young man. He'd never swam in the ocean before, and so they went out and they were enjoying a time together in the ocean, and suddenly they felt pulled a little by the currents, and he didn't quite know how to handle that, and the currents kept pulling him, and he was struggling. He was going under the water, and he wasn't able to get out of the water, and she motioned for a lifeguard to come, and they came, and they rescued him out of the water, pulled him to shore. But it was too late. And he died. And this poor young lady was quoted in the news article saying, never in my wildest dreams, never did I ever think that 3 days after my wedding would I be a widow. I just couldn't quite get over that news story when it came out. Partially, it's just a terrible story in general, but knowing that we had a connection to those people, to that school, many people that I know them. And just to think about that and ask yourself that question, why, right? Why would that happen? They came back and had a funeral, and Dalton's parents helped her get settled in the apartment, helped her open up the wedding gifts that all the people had given them. It was a painful time, and I'm sure that there's going to be more pain in the future. We need to remember her, Cheyenne, in our prayers as we think about that situation. Why do bad things happen to undeserving people? Our world loves to ask this question every time a hurricane comes, every time a tornado levels homes, every time a shooter goes on a shooting spree or a terrorist carries out his murderous plans. The world screams to those of us who believe in God, why? How can you believe in a God that claims to be loving, yet allows all this to happen? The world is asking us that question, and we find ourselves even asking that question as well, and those questions even surge to our mind even in the small things in life, don't they? Why, Lord, did my washing machine die 3 days before vacation? Been there before? Why did my car break down again right after I got it back from the shop? In my case, why, Lord, is my AC and my water heater failing at the same time? True story. Now you see other things that are happening and you realize that your problems may pale in comparison to some of these big things, but we still ask the question, don't we? Why, Lord? Why does it seem to happen? Just makes you struggle. Many individuals can identify with Job, whose distresses, as we read in the book, were agonizingly prolonged and so seemingly unfair. So many people wonder why they undergo tragedy and affliction and suffering, why they experience these things. And suffering is hard for anyone, but suffering is especially difficult when it seems to strike those who you'd consider to be righteous or undeserving. And the question, why do bad things happen? What's the rest of it? To good people. That's a question in the book of Job. The question in the book of Jonah, as we studied last summer, why do good things happen to bad people? And there's this paradox, and we see those paradoxes both played out in this book of Job. And as you read about Job, and maybe some of you this morning as I'm talking about it, you don't even know the story of Job, that's fine. We're going to get very acquainted with the story of Job, but I think a lot of you probably, even if you haven't been in church a whole lot, you've maybe heard of Job. You've heard of the struggles that Job went through and Job endured. Job's suffering was intense. It was financial, it was emotional, it was physical, it was spiritual. Everybody was against him, even God, it seemed. And Job had served faithfully. We read in the text that Job was an upright man, that he was a righteous person. And it addresses that mystery of unmerited misery, that why does somebody suffer who's not guilty of any wrongdoing? And that's what God gives us in this book. And as you look at the book of Job, you might flip through a few pages, you realize that it doesn't end soon. You flip and you flip and you flip, and it just seems to go on and on and on. And yes, there are 42 chapters in the book of Job. God in his providence has given us a long book in the book of Job. And it's easy to preach this or to study it in a short context. A lot of times you might hear a sermon series that gives the introduction and skips over all the middle stuff and then gives the end, and just a nice, tidy little sermon series on the book of Job, but I don't think that's how God designed it. A while back, I listened to a sermon series from a megachurch pastor, a church that I wouldn't recommend somebody going to, but this is what he said. He goes, "We at this church, we preach through books of the Bible. That's why we're doing Job. And that's why we're going to spend 4 whole Sundays on the book of Job." And I thought he was joking. Like I was waiting for the punchline to come, but he was being serious. He was lauding the fact they were spending 4 whole Sundays on the book of Job. 42 chapters. How are you going to do that, bud? 10 chapters. I mean, it's just like this magnitude, this huge book to try to fit into 4. I don't know how you do that. So I'm here to tell you this morning, for the next 173 Sundays, we're going to be in the book of Job. So just buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be marvelous. You're going to be thoroughly depressed by the time we get done with this book, okay? It's not going to be that. I've got it slated, I think, so I'm not even going to tell you how long I have it slated for, because it's still in flux just a little bit. But why did God give us such a long book? Why did he give us a long study in this subject? I think God gave us a long study is because you can't figure out these tensions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? How can there be a loving God, yet there be such intense suffering in the world? I don't think you can figure out the answers to these questions in a mini-series. I don't think that you can come to the answer in a tweetable quote. In fact, God invites us on a journey, a long journey of slowly chewing through the question and mulling it over in different ways. There's no instant answer. There's no sense in which you say, take 2 pills tonight and in the morning and give me a call later in the week and we'll see how you're doing. It's not just a quick answer like that. Because there's no instant working through grief, is there? There's no quick fix or relief for the pain that life sometimes brings. There's no message of Job in a nutshell, because it does take time to work through it. And Job is poetry, which adds another dimension. Poetry is not black and white. Poetry is not cut and dry. Poetry requires meditation and pondering, and there's some mystery to poetry, and I think that is intentional. The majority of the book is poetry, just to kind of set the whole thing in a mystery, to set it in a frame that says you've got to just sort of ponder and figure this thing out. And that's what we have before us. And that's what we're going to embark to do, to walk through the 42 chapters of the book of Job and to chew through and ponder the question and to come to the answers. So what is the book of Job? Where did it come from? Well, first and foremost, Job is literature, and as I said, it's poetry. It's viewed as some of the greatest literature in all of the world. It's been heralded as a masterpiece, unequaled in all literature. A man by the name of Thomas Carlyle said once, "There's nothing written, I think, in the Bible or out of it of equal literary merit." The book of Job ranks up there with all of the literature of the world. Job is an outstanding book. It's an outstanding literary production because of its rich vocabulary and metaphors and illustrations that it uses, and it grabs things from all over life and geography and hunting and mining and travel and weather and zoology and all these different terms and terminologies you find in the book of Job. It's no wonder that Alfred Tennyson labeled the book the greatest poem of ancient or modern times. And I want you to be exposed to the wonderful work of art that the book of Job is. When was Job written? Who was Job written by? You ready for the answer? Nobody quite knows 100%. And so there's a little bit of mystery even with the authorship and the date. Many believe that it could have been Moses or Elihu or some other folks that we find in the book, but probably the best opinion is that the book of Job was written by Job himself, because after this ordeal, Job lived another 140 years, and so he had a lot of time on his hands to write it. And as you read it, it's so first person, it's so intimate, the details are so well known that it seems to be someone who was there, first person, had to have written this story. I believe personally Job composed this, and I think this was probably the first book of the Bible ever written. Because in the book of Job, we find no mention of the Jewish people, we find no mention of Israel, we find no mention of the Mosaic Law or anything like that, which means I believe it predates Moses. And because of the language of Job and the way that his wealth is accounted for in camels and donkeys and servants and those things, it really compares closely with how Abraham's wealth is accounted for in that time period. And so we think Job may have been a contemporary of Abraham. So there you go. That's where we're placing it. That's the time frame that it was written. A long time ago, a story of a real person who lived a real life. And so as we embark upon the series, I want to put some questions out here this morning, and admittedly this sermon is going to ask more questions than it's going to answer, because we want to answer questions as we go. And so here are some critical questions about the book of Job. The number one question of the book of Job, the most critical question of this entire book is this: is God just in his administration of the world? Is God just in how he's decided to administer the world? And what the book of Job does is it explores God's policies, his policies of administrating this world. Some people look at the book of Job and think that Job is on trial, that Job's righteousness is on trial, and it's actually not the case. In fact, God is on trial in the book of Job. God is placing himself on trial. God has put this book in our Bible so he can take the witness stand before us and come to the end of that and say, yes, he is innocent. He is vindicated for the way that he runs his world and how he operates his administration. And so what is God on trial for? God is on trial for how things function in the world. And here's the question that needs to be answered in relationship to how God administers his world. The question really isn't even so much, why do the righteous suffer, as much as it is this: why should we worship and why should we be righteous if I'm going to suffer anyway? That's the question. And so God's administration is on trial. And that idea of us being Christians, of us seeking righteousness, of us worshiping God, and in exchange for our worship sometimes getting suffering as a response. Why worship if that's what you're going to get? An author named Christopher Ash said it like this: let's be honest, let's have no more of this pious make-believe stuff that it goes well for good people and badly for bad people. It's not true. Look around the world. It's simply not true. By and large, people who could not care about God live happier, longer lives with less suffering than believers. Why is this the case? What kind of God runs a world like this? Now, there's a Little bit of exaggeration there. I don't know if that's exactly the truth, that unbelievers live longer, happier lives, but you understand where that quote is going, that you do look around the world and you wonder about those things. And so, question 1, is God just in his administration of the world? Question number 2 that we need to answer as we go through this, what kind of Christianity do we want? If God is just in administrating the world and how we relate to that, then what kind of Christianity do we want to live? The book of Proverbs is a wonderful guide to life. The principles in the book of Proverbs are general truths about God's administration. The book of Proverbs talks a lot about the righteous will flourish and the evil people will die and they will demise and at some point go down. That's kind of the book of Proverbs. But speaking in general truths, this is what you would call the retributive principle. The word retributive is from retribution, that God rewards the righteous and punishes evil. And as you read through the book of Proverbs, those are the maxims that you find. Those are the truths that you find, that the righteous flourish and the evil are destroyed. And that's generally the truth. However, the book of Job helps us understand that though those are general principles of truth, that God is not bound to run this world by the retributive principle. That God does not have to always function like that. That God's sovereign rule of the world cannot be reduced to a rigid black and white system of retributive principles. That sometimes the righteous do suffer. That sometimes evil people are rewarded, it seems, for their evil. And though this is the standard mode, the retributive principle is standard. It is a principle that God generally does function this way, as taught in Proverbs. We see in the book of Job that it's not always that way. And so we're working through that fact that it's not always that way. And then it presses us to try to come to what kind of Christianity that we want as a result of that. If we're honest with each other, all of us desire a Christianity that's based on the retributive principle. Let me illustrate it like this. All of us would love it to know that we had a list, and that on this list you were required to go to church 45 Sundays every year. And on this list you were required to read your Bible a certain amount every day in a certain number of chapters. All of us would love to know the number of hours of community service that we are required to serve by God inside the church. We would all love to know how many people we're required to disciple in a lifetime. And if we do all of those things, if we check all of those boxes, then what's going to happen at the end is that God's going to bless us with a good life, with no suffering, and lots of money and good things. How many of you would like to have an arrangement like that? Let me see your hands. Y'all are nervous, to be honest, right? It does sound good. And though we know that that's not the truth, though we know that's not how Christianity functions, I think all of us have that idea planted deep in our minds in some ways. Because when bad things happen, you do end up thinking, I have served God faithfully. What in the world did I go to church all that time for? Those thoughts do come to your mind. Because all of us deeply in our minds have that retributive principle in our minds, and we ultimately want Christianity to function like that. Just to put it in its most crude terminology, you would call that the prosperity gospel. And some people try to erase the tension of the book of Job by promoting the prosperity gospel that says if you're good, if you do what you're supposed to do, God's going to bless you materially. Some of the preachers of prosperity gospel, like T.D. Jakes, for example, you may have heard his name. He has an estimated personal wealth of over $100 million. And that's because, as he says, God's blessing on his life. I think maybe I'm preaching in the wrong denomination. Not really. Prosperity gospel. But that's really not how the Christian life is supposed to work. Real Christianity recognizes there's a general principle of retributive theology. God rewards the righteous, God punishes the evil. But instead, we do also see that there's a tension, that there's difficulty. It doesn't always work that way. And we see that the greatest prize of the Christian life is not material blessing, but the greatest prize of the Christian life is gaining Jesus Christ. And that sometimes God uses suffering to help us gain more of Jesus Christ. And us gaining Christ is the most loving thing that God can do for us, even if it requires suffering. So what kind of a Christianity do you want? Number 3, what kind of Jesus do you need? If being a Christian is not summarized in the retributive principle, an intense suffering and pain may come to me despite me doing my best and living a blameless life, then what's the point? Why do I need Jesus? What benefit is Jesus to me? That's part of the beauty of the book of Job. Because the book of Job does foreshadow a man to come whose greatness exceeds even Job, whose sufferings were greater than Job, and whose perfect obedience to his father was only seen faintly in Job. And knowing that God does not allow suffering and remain aloof from suffering, but God's always allowed suffering, knowing that he himself would enter into that suffering personally in the most horrific way imaginable in order to ultimately save his creation from all suffering and sin someday. That's what we find as we go through the book of Job. This shadow, this foreshadowing to Jesus. So what kind of a Jesus do you want? Do you want a Lucky Charm Jesus to make your life go better? Or do you want the suffering Jesus who suffered for you so that you could live a suffering-free eternity in the presence of your Creator? Do you want a Jesus who saves you from suffering now, or a Jesus who brings eternal purpose and design to your suffering and makes you more like him in the process? So before going further, let's ask some important questions that we'll find as we go through the book of Job. Number 1, why do the righteous suffer? Number 2, where is God when tragedy strikes? 3, if God is all loving, how can he allow human suffering? 4, does God really care about us? 5, does God demand some kind of payment or sacrifice in return for his goodness? 6, where is God when life hurts? 7, why does God sometimes seem to be silent when we suffer? So let's embark into this text. What we're going to see in the first half of this chapter is a cast of characters. And so we're introduced as we read the first verses to this man named Job, a blameless but beleaguered man. And we start in the first couple of verses and we learn first about Job's wisdom. It says, there was a man in the country of Uz, not to be confused with the land of Oz. Job was not a wizard. The land of Uz. We're not exactly sure where the land of Uz was, but the land of Uz was most likely close to Israel and Jordan, somewhere in a desert area in that part of the world. It's identified sometimes with Edom. Edom is the modern country of Jordan. That gives you the general idea of where this was. Job, as it says, was blameless. There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, that's a great statement, isn't it? When I die, I would love to have that written on my tombstone. I'd love to have that said at my funeral, that I was a man of integrity who was blameless, who turned away from evil. That's the first verse of this book. This clears up right away for us the person of Job and who he was and his righteousness. He was a righteous and upright person. It says it right there, first verse. He was from the land of Uz. He was blameless. He feared God as much as somebody could. He was not sinless, but he was blameless. The longer the story goes, and because of the urging of Job's friends, we're tempted to think that Job is hiding something, right? All right, Job, what did you really do? I know everybody thinks you're a great guy, but what actually happened? What are you hiding from us? Nothing. The text doesn't give us that chance, because several times, just in the first couple of chapters, it says that Job was blameless. He was upright. He was a righteous person. Ezekiel chapter 14 tells us that Job was one of the most godly men that ever lived on this planet. So he truly was righteous, and that's what makes the paradox of Job so difficult, is you have one of the most righteous people that ever lived suffering in one of the most intense ways that anybody's ever suffered. So we see his wisdom. He's a blameless and righteous person. We also see his wealth. Job had, as it says here, verse 2, 7 sons and 3 daughters, 10 kids. In that day, that was not uncommon to have 10 kids. These days, if you have 10 kids and you walk into Walmart, you look like you're a freak or something. People look at you strange, right? Back in those days, this was great. This was wealth. You were a wealthy person if you had that many kids, and you were blessed of God to have that many kids. As it goes on, it describes more about his wealth. His estate included 7,000 sheep and goats. Can you imagine? I mean, I've been to the state fair before, but that doesn't compare. 7,000 sheep and goats, and you just imagine the number of servants that it would take to run a household like this. 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys. That's just the female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Look what it says at the end of verse 3. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. What do we find about Job? Is that he made Time magazine's richest man in the world. Job was exceedingly wealthy and exceedingly blessed. We also see, as a result of his righteousness, his watchfulness as well. Look what it says in verse 4. His sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Now, when we hear that in 2019, when we hear that verse, we automatically think that there was some kind of sin taking place, especially with the next verses that come, that the children were partying in a wild and sinful sort of way, but that's not necessarily the case. What we find potentially in this day, that feasting was common. It was common to have people come into your home for a feast, for a birthday party, or for some kind of a celebration or a holiday. We have no indication that these were sinful, indulgent type parties. It just says they got together for feasts, that they were hospitable to one another. But Job was such an upright man. Look what he did. Verse 5, whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for all of them. He would just to make sure. And it wasn't for the sins maybe they had committed, but it was for sins of the heart. You notice his focus is on the heart. Look what it says next. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts. This wasn't for outward sin. So that's another proof to me that this wasn't like wild, drunken parties. Job's sacrificing for his kids was based upon sin in the heart, because Job knew the truth that we learn later in Romans chapter 1, verse 21, that by nature we don't honor God or give thanks to him. He was consciously worried that his children would turn away from God. So we get through the first 5 verses of the book of Job, and at this point everything is a Disney movie, isn't it? It's wonderful. You have this rich man, a sheik of the East, who's rich and has a big family, and everybody's partying and they're happy. The world is as it should be. A good guy living a good life and being blessed for it. All of us would love it, be satisfied if we could put a period right there. We could say, that's it, that's the way life works. If I'm good, God blesses me, and I end up like Job. Sorry. There's 42 chapters in this book. There's a lot to come. And so we introduce ourselves now to the rest of the cast of characters. There's this person named Satan. Satan is a hater of God and those who worship God. And so as we see in verse 6, we begin to learn a little bit about Satan. And in fact, the book of Job instructs us a lot about Satan in the demonic realm. We see first that Satan is a wanderer. It says, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came with them, and the Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? And Satan says, from roaming through the earth. Satan answered him, and walking around on it. So we learn a few things. We learn that Satan still has access to heaven. There's just some things that help us in this text, some misnomers that this breaks. There's a lot of people that believe that Satan is in hell, that Satan is the leader of hell, and that's absolutely not the case. Listen, Satan has never, ever one time been to hell. He does not want to go to hell. Hell is the place of confinement for him. It's the place of torment for him. He's never been to hell. He will not be the president of hell someday. It's his place of torment. So push that out of your mind as we come on to the Halloween season, okay? And you see pictures of Satan with flames behind him. Not true. He's on the earth. He has access to the earth. We also learn that he has access to heaven. that he comes and he converses with God. And some people think, well, how can a holy God allow sin in his presence? Well, when we say those things, we're talking about fellowship. We're talking about the idea that God can't allow a relationship with sin. But it doesn't mean that he's completely separated from sin, because God's omnipresent. He's constantly in proximity of people who are sinful. And so here he is talking to Satan. That's not a violation of God's character. We also learn that the sons of God, as it says in the text, and we know that that word, that phrase in the text means angels. On the day the sons of God came to present themselves, that's a way of referring to angels. And so it seems that there are regular times when the angels, and potentially even the demons, and even Satan have to come before God and give reports. I don't know what this is like. It's probably kind of interesting. God sits them all down. Anybody have any questions? Can you tell me, how are things going? Ed, can you tell me how it's going over in Iowa? You're the angel in charge of Iowa. Oh, we also want to just make sure that you get your nominations in for the Angel of the Month award. We love doing this. It's a lot of fun. I don't know what it's like. There's meetings. There's an administration that God runs with his angels, and they come and they report. And Satan happened to come on this day to report. We don't know if he was required to, or if he just showed up to crash the party. And so he's a wanderer. Sometimes he wanders into heaven and he has conversations with God. We also learn that Satan is an accuser, verses 8 through 11, and this is what he says, verse 8, "Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job?'" Now I think we're jumping into a conversation here, because I think maybe there's something that preceded that. Maybe Satan was talking about different people that are supposedly serving God, and God says, "Have you considered Job?" Either way you cut it, God knew that Satan was moving this direction. God knew Satan was coming to talk about Job, and God, in a sense, preempts it. God says about Job, listen to verse 8, this is another proof that Job was truly a righteous person. "No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." That's coming from the mouth of God. Job truly was a righteous person. Verse 9, Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will certainly curse you to your face." Satan is an accuser. He comes to God and he says, "Yeah, God, of course he's pious. Of course he worships you. He's pious, he worships, he sacrifices, he goes to church every Sunday, he even goes to church on Wednesdays, he reads his Bible all the time. Of course he does, because he's tapped into this thing called the prosperity gospel, God. The more good he does, the more you bless him. You've given him all this wealth, you've given him a great marriage, you've given him 10 kids, and he's just worshiping in order to get more good things from your hand. Of course he's righteous." Or is he? Satan says. Maybe, God, maybe Job is righteous because you're giving him all the nice stuff. Maybe his worship of you is not sincere after all. Maybe he's only worshiping because he gets good things in return for his worship. In fact, God, I want to give a wager. Let's shake on it. I'll bet you if you take everything away from him, I'll bet you it'll prove that he's a fraud. I'll bet you it'll prove that he's not worshiping you from genuine motives. I'll bet you it's going to prove that Job is a fake. And God takes the wager, so to speak. I don't want to put God in gambling terms. It's a little dangerous, but you understand the point. Is Job truly a man who worships? Or is he only worshiping to get good things in response? Job, Satan claimed, would no longer insert his coins of worship into the cosmic candy machine if no treats came out the bottom anymore. That's what Satan was proposing. It suggested that the only way, and Satan was suggesting this to God, the only way, God, that you ever get anybody to worship you is if you give them nice stuff. Now, this calls into question Job's integrity and Job's character. This is also calling God's character into question as well. Satan is challenging God, telling God that you have no true worshipers unless they only get nice things in return. And so we see the challenge is on. Are there true worshipers? Are there people that will love and worship God even if life crashes down around them? And you see, for us, when that happens, We can glorify God. We can show that God is truly worthy of worship when we worship Him despite the fact that life crashes down around us. This book is not so much about Job's character. This book is about defending God's character as worthy of worship in this universe. I want you to see he was the wanderer, he's the accuser, and he is also the tormentor, and we're going to learn more about this soon because we're ending this sermon at verse 12. It says, "Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself." So Satan left the Lord's presence. And this is where we're introduced to our third main character of the story, and that's God. We learn a lot about God at this juncture. Many of these will be teased out as we go through the series, but here's some things that we learn about God. These are very important. Number one, God affirms Job's innocence. 2 times God says Job's a righteous person. He affirms Job's innocence. Number 2, God loves and cares for Job. You can't deny that through the book. He loves Job. He's affirming Job. 3, God defends His own glory. Listen, God defends His own glory for Job's benefit. So everything that happened to Job was to defend the glory of God for Job's benefit. 4, God holds Satan on a leash. If there's nothing else you get out of this sermon series, I hope that you understand that. You notice here that Satan couldn't do a thing without the permission of God. God holds Satan on a leash. 5, God is culpable for what happened to Job. Please don't read this book and think that somehow God gets a pass on what happened to Job. No, He is responsible. God is culpable for what happened to Job. Number 6, God's administration of this universe is fairly complicated to figure out, which is why He gave us 42 chapters in this book to unravel that mystery. And so let's just pause on that last one for a moment. God's administration of this world is complicated. I want you to see this morning something that was a huge aha moment for me this week. It's really changed a lot of the way that I think, and I'm like, man, I've been a pastor this long, and this is honestly the first time I ever thought of it this way, but there's 3 kind of models for how the world is governed. Here's models for how the world's governed. The first model of how the world's governed is polytheism. And what that means is that there are multiple gods, and depending on what religion you're part of, there could be millions or thousands of gods. There's multiple gods in the universe, gods and goddesses and spirits. None of them are perfect. Many of them are exceedingly evil. You read about this in some of the Greek mythology or the Roman gods. You have all these gods, and some are kind of good and some are really bad, and they can all have some level of control over life, and it puts the world in a state of anxiety and makes us have to try to appease these different gods, to try to worship these different gods in different ways in order to curry favor and blessing from these gods. Now you ask, who believes this? This would be the beliefs of, say, like Buddhism or Hinduism or some of the modern religions that believe in multiple gods. And let me just say, it's no way to live, because you're constantly worried that you're not pleasing this God or that God, and you could get cursed or blessed based upon your behavior. It's a very difficult way to try to live, trying to worship a multiplicity of gods. The second way that people explain the ruling of the universe is absolute monotheism. Now, when I read that, I thought, yep, that's it. That's the one. That's what I believe. Then I started reading about it, and it nuanced it a little bit in this one book I was reading. Absolute monotheism said that the world is governed absolutely and simply by just one God. And again, yep, right there, believe it. Then it goes on. Talks about, though, from this standpoint, that this absolute monotheism means that God is in absolute control and everything that happens is in His control. I'm on board with all of this. But it accentuates that objection to how God could be loving yet sovereign. And this is where we kind of run into some trouble, because when you say absolute monotheism, you have God controlling everything, yet God also says He's loving. So how can He both be loving yet be controlling of everything and allow these things to happen in our lives? This is where the tension comes into place. And so this belief of absolute monotheism sees God ruling with an iron fist without sympathy or love. He does what he wants, and he does what's best for his own interests, and he does not factor in goodness or love into the equation. Absolute monotheism is like the God of Islam that rules everything, that has no real concern or care for people, that's not a God of love, but just rules absolutely. That's not my God. Now here's where it's nuanced a little bit. This really helped me a lot as I read a lot this week and the last couple weeks for this series, is monotheistic mediation. Now this is the biblical model, I believe. Monotheistic mediation. The Bible portrays that God is absolutely sovereign. Believe it? Everybody say yes. You believe that? Absolutely sovereign. However, here's the catch. God chooses not to govern the world as the sole supernatural power. Now, he's created all the other supernatural powers, but he doesn't choose to rule outside of those other he doesn't choose to rule as the sole supernatural power. There are other supernatural powers in the world. Some are natural, some are supernatural. The supernatural ones are Satan and demons. Supernatural ones are angels. Natural ones are human beings. This includes us, okay? And we, the angels, Satan, the demons, we've been given some measure of ruling authority by God. Jesus calls Satan the prince and the power of the air. Jesus calls Satan the God of this age. So somehow, in some way, God administers his rule. He's absolutely sovereign, but he administers his rule through the agency at times of Satan and demons and through people and angels. And so it's more complicated than just an absolute monotheism. And this is where the tension comes into play. Why is God doing it like that? And that's what Job ran into as well. Satan comes now in the next verses and doles out intense suffering on Job, yet it is still from the hand of God, but it is through the agency of Satan. And so you have God administering his rule, not as the sole supernatural power, but administering his rule through other entities as well. And that's a game changer for me. That really helped me think through this and think through about God's administration of the world, though it does create some tension in our minds. And that's what we're going to try to fix or solve. We're not going to completely solve it. We're going to try to untangle it to some degree through the series. So how do we bring this all together? How do we wrap this up today? Well, one author describes his suffering as a Jewish boy at Auschwitz during World War II. And this was his conclusion. In that concentration camp, as I stood below the limp body of a little Jewish boy who had just been hung by the neck, I was convinced that God was dead. That's one way we can solve it. There was another person named Weissel, and his retreat was into complete atheism. Another author named Harold Kushner attempted to answer the question in his book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and he offers something that seems better than atheism, just a little bit. And Kushner's thesis is that God exists, and he is loving, but that he is not sovereign, and that God does his best to try to restrain evil, but he doesn't quite get it 100%. That would be what you would call, in Christian terms, open theism. There's different ways people try to spin this out. So what is the answer? Well, I'm not going to give you an answer just yet. In fact, I'm convinced that many times we're too quick with the answers. We're too quick to spill out happy verses or spiritual pats on the back to those who are suffering intensely. But this is where we can start. And I want you to see the big idea for this sermon, and this will kind of carry over through the series, is this: the righteous suffer in the hand of a sovereign and loving God. There's a lot of mystery wrapped up in that sentence, but I think that captures the mystery of this book. The righteous suffer in the hand of a sovereign and loving God. So join us. Join us on this journey through the book of Job. and we'll see together what it means to be crushed in the hand of a righteous and loving God.